please put your hands together and let's welcome Peter Leiden.
Hey, thank you. Wow, thank you very much. What I want to basically do is talk to you on a big picture level, though. I mean, really, the way I like to talk about this is, you know your basic coding. I mean, you're throwing around languages here. But I want to talk about what is going on here in your field, what is going on with technology, and what is going on with other trends related to technology that is really working on almost basically a world historical plane. I mean, there's really a story going on here that people in 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, and more will look back at what was going on around the time of the beginning of the 21st century. And it is really a story that you are all really a part of and you should really be appreciating. And so I'm going to pull back and take a very big picture kind of perspective on this and actually help kind of breathe life into a lot of those statistics that were kind of flying at us there, all of which are good. I'm going to try to kind of put that in context, explain it in these kind of longer strokes, and get a little better sense of really, really the big story that we're living through in our lives today. Now, one of the ways I think, one of the best ways to understand what's going on is that we are really living through a pretty rare transformation on a global scale right now. I mean, I've actually been doing there's a lot of Europeans here. I've been doing a lot of reading on the Enlightenment from about 1640 to 1715, which is an amazing time in European and world history, when really the foundation for scientific method and all the different kind of basic technologies of the Industrial Revolution were starting to be thought through. It was an incredible time, a time of really massive upheaval and transformation. And it's one that now we look at and we kind of really understand in its distillation what really took place there. We're in that kind of time now. We're really in that kind of time. And we're in a kind of, it's basically a time of really fundamental reworking of all the basic foundations of how the economy works, how the society works, how people communicate, how everything connects up together. And you hear some of that rhetoric around, in these kind of tech conferences. But we should really be thinking deeply about what does that really mean. Now, if you take these moments globally, or if you take them, in our case, in the United States here, there's quite a few Americans here, and I will be, as an American, kind of filtering some of this into how it's actually hitting this country here. But there's really two fundamental things that drives these periods of kind of rapid innovation that happen for about 10, 20 years. The first thing is a society, and let's just use America just as an example because it's a useful example, you could say, and everyone kind of has at least some basic knowledge of what's happened in this country too. What happens is you get such deep structural changes to the fabric of the economy, the fabric of society, that essentially the old systems for organizing things just don't work. They basically get disrupted in a very fundamental way. So, for example, it's like when you go from an agrarian economy, an economy organized around agriculture, to one organized around industrial production. That's such a fundamental thing that nothing in the old system kind of works in the same way, and you really have to have some kind of burst of really fundamental innovation to figure out how to do that. The other thing that actually drives these changes is essentially unprecedented challenges. It's something appears that your old system has absolutely no way to wrap its head around solving. And so you're forced into kind of really deep and fundamental innovation. Now, this has happened in the case of the United States. So just to kind of put a lens, well, how big a deal is that? It's happened about 4 times in this country. It's happened for those, and again, we're not going to go into total lesson here of history, but there was a period in the very beginning of the 19th century, the Revolution of 1800, which was elected Thomas Jefferson, essentially opened up about a 25-year run of a crazy innovation in politics and in the economy, democratizing the economy happened here, which set up about a 50-year run of how the country worked. Then about mid-century, around the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln, everyone kind of associates him with slavery and the Civil War. Really, it actually ushered in a crazy amount of innovation around the fundamentals of the American economy. I mean, we did things like the transcontinental railroads. We basically had this Homestead Act. We were giving away land. We basically had land-grant universities that completely democratized education in a way that had never happened. 25 years of essentially reinventing America that lasted for the second half, 50 years of the 19th century. And right around the turn of the 20th century, there was an explosion of innovation for about 25 years. We call it the Progressive Era. It was both parties. Republicans here is Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson with the Great League of Nations, as you guys in Europe kind of know too. There was a crazy period of inventing essentially what it was to be early kind of mass urban industrial society. And ultimately, the last one was around the Great Depression of World War II. Again, these things happen. They carry on these very classic patterns. We're in one of those moments now. That's the way to really understand what is going on in this world right now with all the craziness around us at all times. So what is essentially driving our era? Well, the one is, and you're all part of this, we are watching the most fundamental technology transformation at the very basis of society that you could possibly get. And basically, it distills down to the computerization of everything and the interconnection of everything. That's essentially, when you really distill it, that is about as profound as you can get. That's what's happening. The second thing is that is partly driving, and also some other trends are driving, essentially the globalization of it, the global interconnection of everything. In fact, if people, when I mention that thing 50, 100, 200 years from now, when they look back, they'll say the really most fundamental thing that happened at the beginning of the 21st century was the world went global. And all systems have to essentially rework on that plane. We're just in these early stages of trying to sort that out. How do you organize everything globally? That doesn't mean you're not going to organize things locally, too, and within nation states and things like that for a considerable time here. But essentially, we're opening up a whole new way of having to organize things. And the third thing is we are hitting this level of unprecedented challenges, not the least of which is global climate change. But there's all kinds of things, system breakdowns that are working all over the world. I mean, it's, not just global warming, it's global terrorism. We're trying to figure out the educational systems breaking down, the health systems aren't working here, the retirement systems aren't working out here, Europe, other countries as well. It's essentially a system breakdown, and it's basically driven by this very fundamental upheaval that's happening around us. So whether we like it or not, and I like it, we are living through a really amazing moment of transformation in our country and in the world. It's a time of really fundamental transition. It's going from essentially a world organized by these kind of basic nations to much more interconnected global, not just economy, but ultimately, I think, on a level of society almost, you think of it. We're also going, a very fundamental thing happening this century is we're shifting from essentially carbon-based energy to essentially clean energy. It's one that essentially is, we're just beginning to go on here, but really it is going to be one of the most fundamental reworkings of the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Something, again, folks in your capacity should be really tuning into. Even though it's not strictly IT, it is certainly going to have tons of ramifications on information technology. And ultimately, the quick way to think of it is we're basically finally making the transition from a 20th century world that pretty much got sorted out and was working pretty darn well, particularly after World War II, to essentially a 21st century world, which we are just trying to figure out today. So what I'm going to basically do today is try to break that story down into 6 manageable kind of levels. We're going to move through a lot of material here, but I think it's one that you'll actually quite enjoy. One, we're going to go back to some of the basics. And you're all kind of tech savvy here, but I think it's really worth going back to the fundamentals and think, what is really taking place here and how much room do we have left in this digital revolution? And I would say we actually have a lot more room here, essentially, to bring some really unexpected changes. The other thing I'm going to talk about then is I'm particularly looking at new media, and you mentioned some of it here when you set it up here. There's really 3 spaces I want to look ahead on. The mobile space, where it's going, the social space, where it's going, and video, which I think is a much bigger deal than most people wrap their heads around. And we'll talk about that. Another thing when you look into the future is the one key way that you can really, with confidence, kind of look ahead is to think about the fundamental demographics. Once someone's born and once a generation is out, that thing just rolls through the next 80, 100 years. And in fact, there's a lot of ways you can look ahead on what's happening demographically and have a kind of good insight into what's happening, not just in this country, but again, globally. I'm going to shift then quickly. These are all be kind of relatively short things. I want to get into the fundamentals of the economics, talk about some kind of the ramifications of this technology in economics. Ultimately, you mentioned this long boom concept that we had came up with. It's still going strong in many respects. But also the rise of China, talk a little bit about what that is and how that fits in. I do want to bring in this energy thing because I think it's a really fundamental thing. Anybody looking ahead has to kind of start to wrap their head around it. And the final thing I'm going to wrap on is just essentially where this, what I call kind of a problem-solving capacity is essentially going through a big upgrade here. And ultimately, think of it as how collaboration, software, and ways that we can kind of work together with a lot of sophistication, how that's actually improving and hitting a new kind of plane here, which could actually be a save the day in many respects. Anyhow, there's a lot going on here. What I like to do is I'm going to touch on a lot of little facts you may have heard in other contexts, but connect the dots do everything with a little bit of a forward spin to throw it forward, and we'll kind of run through a lot of material here that I hope you'll find will be fun. Digital revolution. Now, you guys are all the technologists here, but let's go back to Moore's Law. You guys basically, I'm not going to have to re-explain to different crowds, you might have to do this. But essentially, it's the quick ways, you know, you get twice as many integrated circuits on a chip, shrinks the power, boosts the power, shrinks, and drops the price, basically, as we all know. Now, the one thing I kind of remind people, even in your capacity, is what this doubling thing is going. Now, those first few years of that doubling, those chips were basically just going a little bit bigger, those are all doubling, right? And it's not that big a deal. But it's when you start getting the doublings after, boom, 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 and then the next one goes whoomp through the roof, and the next one goes 2 stories up, and then it goes 4 stories up. If you keep riding that thing for 30 years, which is what's happened with this law, you get some extraordinary changes in power. So the basic things are, you guys have seen over the 30 years of a lot of you folks in this career, first PC there, 1 megahertz was basically 5 grand in today's kind of dollars, or roughly today's dollars. 30 years later, a 2 gigahertz Dell essentially is $1,000. Now, if you do the math on that, essentially it's 10,000 times more powerful in that period. Or if you flip it around and want to look at the money, it's 10,000 times cheaper. Now, 10,000 times is like a pretty wild number. I mean, here's the actual consequence of this. If you took a supercomputer, basically back in the mid-70s, this is essentially by metaflops, basically, clock speed essentially is the way to compare this one. It would have cost you $31 million for that 150 megaflops. Right now, the average iPad 2 has more. It's faster. It's less than 500 bucks. I mean, that's the kind of thing that's actually happening in concrete terms. So that starts to drive, oh my God, that kind of power in the tools. And we still got, as we know, a lot of juice left in essentially expanding that. So one side, you got these tools going into everything are getting crazily kind of powerful. The second thing is the great network effect of the net and Metcalfes Law, which again, you guys are probably familiar with. But essentially, in reviewing it, you start going, what it really is talking about is that same exponential doubling that essentially goes in the power of connecting up networks. And the basic insight here, which I think is a good one and worth reviewing, is essentially, even if you take any telecom thing and even a phone situation, the key thing is if you have 2 different networks, which have 2 people in it, or 5 people, or 1,000 people in it, all it takes is one connection between those 2 things, and it's not adding one person of value, it's adding all those people into the network. And so you get these big boom shocks of kind of aggregating value as you aggregate up networks. And ultimately, you know, this is the logic behind the internet. Well, where that takes you, again, update ourselves a little bit here, is you've now got, these are the, you know, relatively recent statistics here. You've got 2 billion people now online in the world, right? Okay, there's 6.5 billion people on the planet. The other thing now you've got is you've essentially got 75% of the planet now have cell phones. 5 billion people have cell phones. It's only that little chunk there that is really unconnected. Now again, as bandwidth gets bigger, broader bandwidth to those kind of little phones, and as the power of those little phones, as we all know, gets more and more powerful, you've essentially got the whole planet, as thought about, connected through powerful computers, through large bandwidth connections. You've got a pretty amazing situation here in the next 5 to 10 years. We've finally kind of seen that vision that we started with in early Wired of actually it's coming to fruition. So if you look at the numbers here, internet penetration, this is essentially by region of the world here. This is North America's, you know, actually the highest penetration in 2010. Basically getting close to 80% of the population is fully connected to the internet. Now Europe, because of Eastern Europe, Western Europe thing, those stats come down a little bit, although in general the culture is roughly as connected. Oceania, you know, is the few islands out in the Pacific there, so of course that kind of distorts it. It's a little different. There's not that many people, and if you were on an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you would want to be connected to the internet, I'll tell you. But anyhow, the more interesting numbers are these other regional numbers. I mean, look at the Middle East, 30%, right? Ah, that's interesting. A lot of stuff's going on in the Middle East, right? Anyhow, look at those numbers. They're starting to really hit. And the whole world now is about at 30%. Actually, this is a little bit at odds with what I just pointed out to you, but it's close to the same exact number there as is basically about 30% of the planet. Now, these are the numbers in 10 years ago, at the turn of the century, the millennium, those were the numbers. I mean, just remember that. Even in North America, there's only 30% roughly of people were online in 2000. So we've watched, and in those other regions like the Middle East and that, they essentially were offline. So we've only watched this last decade, boom. And as I say, that's all going to get pushed up towards 100% penetration, or if not 100, let's say 80 or 90% penetration worldwide within this decade for sure. And so what happens? Now I get partly why, people talk about this technology, but you can see in the numbers how this is working. Now let's shift here, the fundamentals. That's actually, for you guys, I think it's more of a refresher course. And this is somewhat, in here too, we'll be connecting dots that you've already seen, but let's throw the story down. We'll go to the valley here. There's really 3 areas I want to explore, basically through the 3 big companies, 3 of the key companies in the valley there. And again, I'm always looking at this, what's next in this space? Well, the first thing you got to do, of course, is Jobs. Is quite a remarkable guy. Because he had this dogged vision of this personal computer and this thing that essentially was a mobile idea from the very beginning. He doggedly kept at it. Now, as we know, he was a baby boomer, and there's another, Bill Gates, the other baby boomer. It's kind of interesting to watch the play of their stories that you hear. So this is market cap of the 2 companies from 1990 there, in the beginning, where they essentially were equal. We forget before Windows and all, they were essentially the same companies with the same kind of prospects. And that big leap up forward of Microsoft was, of course, the great boom in the great run-up. But why did they go and the other one didn't? Well, Microsoft had a much different focus than Jobs. They were thinking business, and business was ready in the 90s, and business jumped on that web, and boom, the value of Microsoft went through the roof. But Jobs had that longer-term, different vision, and he kept at it. And so where does that stock price start going up? It starts going up when they basically shifted towards the iPad, the iPod, iPhone, iPad trajectory. And now, in fact, Apple is the most valuable tech company in the world, and in fact, it's on the way up, and essentially Microsoft is kind of been, relatively static, but still a very valuable company and still a very big player in the tech space, to be sure, and I think they're your partners here too. But I mean, actually, what's driving the next story here is this singular vision. Well, despite our little problem here with this thing right here, I do want to say, I do think one of the this little last stroke of the tablet is a really critical piece of what's going on here. Not just because, it's a new piece of technology. It's the one thing, in my opinion, that we've been waiting for to really solidify basically the digital transition of all media to digital form. Because you really had to figure out a way that how do you really deal with long form, deep, long, involved pieces? Books, magazines, and newspapers. And this finally cracks it in a way that the little phone didn't, and the laptop, which was too big and couldn't curl up in bed, can't do it either. This does that. And it does it in such a way that it also integrates it with a really good experience of video, which, as we'll talk about, is a huge thing also coming together. This thing is definitely in everybody. Basically, it's good. Everyone's going to have these in basically a couple years here. And again, if you just look at the numbers, they're pretty amazing. In the first 9 months of the iPad, it was 15 million of them solved. They were using this thing, not just Apple, but others were talking about it as the fastest growing new product, not just tech product, in history. It went so fast. They're figuring about 50 million of these iPad 2s coming out now. And the numbers are quite astounding. They sold 100 million books, e-books, in just the first 9 months. These are the 9-month stats. And people were wondering, well, will people really read books on an electronic thing? Well, Apple, not even in the book business, sells 100 million books. That discussion's over. Now, of course, there's like 50, the Consumer Electronics Show early this year. They literally had no less than 50 different companies and models that are coming in the wake here. And so it's pretty clear that the foundation of the machine is ready. The reading is like, you talk about, these are the Kindle phenomena too. There are now more e-books. E-books now sell more than all paperbacks. If you combine hardbacks and paperbacks, they just barely edge out e-books sold on Amazon here. And as we well know, this is all just the very early days of this. It is clear this is a superior way to read books, and this is the way it's all going, right? And you guys are publishers, and so it's clear that you're making this shift in some respect, but it's clearly coming in faster than basically anyone was really anticipating it, and it's here. Now, the other thing that's neat about this is once you actually take books into this space, you're watching a metamorphosis of what a book is. This is Al Gore's book, The Choice, on the iPad, and it really is a really actually interesting experience. It's not fully exploiting the capabilities of the iPad. Actually, my company Next Agenda is doing a project right now where we are trying to push those boundaries of what you can do with an app and actually redo a book. We're doing a book on future mobile media through an app. But it's quite interesting how you can integrate video and do all these kind of things, all these interactive ways you can do this. Now, so books themselves, long-form, deep intellectual inquiries, are going to go through a big change when they take advantage of this new capability. So that's the kind of consumption side, the critical piece of the consumption side, which does affect your business. The second side is the production side, and we talk a lot about this, but it's worth kind of going over what's interesting here to take a little forward spit on this one, too. I mean, here's an iPhone 2, and again, it's happening with all the Android phones and all the other phones. I'm just picking on Apple as a good example of where they're blazing the trail here a little bit. These things are now shooting HD video. I mean, HD video, for folks in this space, it used to cost you even 10 years ago, like 10 grand for a camera that, would basically do HD video. And now, essentially, every one of these things can shoot at that level. As we well know, you're always connected. There's 100 million of them now and going. And again, these are just kind of breaking a trail. There's all kinds of other models, as we well know. So now we're starting to get, like I said, in the hands of these people, incredibly powerful tools. Tools that, again, were unthinkable even 10 years ago. Apps. The numbers are crazy, but what are apps? Apps are essentially the simplification of very complex things that you guys used to do. If you guys, it's hard that if you had to be a techie to code your own way into some kind of crazy thing that made something, to make media work or to produce media at a sophisticated level, now they're essentially making it so simple that you just push, bang, boom, it's done. And this is really opening up a lot more turf, too. So the app phenomenon is essentially a democratization phenomenon that we should be focused on. And this is the one I would say is the forward spin one that I would really point out to technologists like you that I think is a big deal now, finally. I do think we've now got this connection between the video connections between all these devices is now integrated into everything Apple does. Every single device now, they have this FaceTime connection. And it's not just that. You got Google now with the Google Talk, and you got Microsoft just buying Skype. This is really now, everyone's starting to bank on this idea that the big, wide channels of video are going to start moving and connecting all these devices in ways that we hadn't been able to exploit up until this time. Now, why is this a big deal? Is human beings have been working for whenever you want to start thinking, a million years now. We've perfected how you communicate face-to-face. The nuance, the complexity of information you could do it just through facial expressions, through a wink, through a bead of sweat, through everything that's actually doing. You see so much more information. You can communicate so much more complexly and richly through face-to-face than between, trying to figure out in a text message, what you're paying it on in a text message. I mean, what can people really think about your emotional state, what you're really saying, all the different ways of, it's very crude, it's super crude information. And now we're able, everyone who's texting could also open up a live video channel between each other. That's a quantum leap in complexity of information, and that's what we're about to do. Because let's shift to that, actually. The broadband web and essentially the implications of video. And let's think about this. Again, these are all pieces that you're seeing, but I just want to kind of reframe them in a different way for you guys and to think, I see what's really going on there, which is really interesting here. Now, to tell this story, I think you got to look at the Google guys. Now, Google, you can talk about them in a lot of different capacities, but I'm going to focus on the video piece of this, them buying YouTube. And really, because I really think that video piece is underappreciated. Now, the way I kind of tell this story, and you guys have lived through a lot of this, is just there's really two booms of the internet. The great 90s boom you talked about when I was at Wired was essentially the low bandwidth internet and essentially transformed all the media that could get sucked in those tighter pipes, as they say. And then the high bandwidth internet, which essentially sucked in total succession. You could just see it right on cue. The next biggest files were what? Audio files. Who got hit next? Music industry, Napster, all that was the early part of the decade. What's the next biggest files after that? Video files. Which is the next one that got hit? Basically, you watch television get hit mid-decade, and now you're essentially watching Hollywood, Netflix, all that's happening now with movie-level kind of things. It's all hitting. It's completely understood. It's a matter, it's just a function of bandwidth. basically, is one way to think about what happened here. You could see it in the beginning, and this, you mentioned this Wired in the 93, 94, 95, 96. You could see this happening, but no one believed it. But basically now it's happened. So now we've essentially got this infrastructure where we can move that kind of level of information. This is the density information just kind of in size, the difference between the text, image, and video. Now, huge files, as you know. But the reason it's huge and why it's important is you can move a lot of information. Like I mentioned, the wink, the nod, the subtleties that you couldn't do in any of these other things. So here's a geeky one that you guys actually, you would probably appreciate. This is essentially watching what happened on the backbone of the internet from 1990 to 2010. So the last 20 years of traffic on the internet. Now what's interesting here is if you look at the bottom there, that web one, of course the web didn't exist at the beginning of the 90s, right? And then by 2000, when essentially the top of the dot-com boom, essentially more than half of the traffic on the backbone of the internet was the web, right? Well, what started happening with that blue thing there? You know, video always had a little sliver. There was real audio, real video and all that kind of stuff we were playing with, but we couldn't, it was not until YouTube, it was right about 2005, not just YouTube, but essentially the bandwidth opened up, boom, video explodes. Video is now more than half of all traffic on the internet right now is video. Now, coming from Cisco, who should know something about this, they're predicting basically over 90% of all traffic on the internet will be video within basically 2015 here, which is 4 years from now. Now, that doesn't mean this other stuff's going to go away because, of course, the pipes are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But as a percentage of what goes over the traffic, it's basically video. So again, you guys' company, anybody's strategy has got to start adjusting in a very fundamental way to moving video. Video, 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 which is interesting. You guys, 3 cameras here. I'm telling you, I used to do these talks 2 years ago. No one would ever video these things. And now, in fact, everybody's videoing these things. And it's because of the cheapness of the tools, but also the utility of moving this stuff now, which is great. So this accounts for, you know, YouTube. Now, remind yourself where you just went back in time to the 90s. It was only 2005. In fact, it was December of 2005 when YouTube launched. I mean, that's not a long time ago, folks. And now we've got essentially 2 billion videos a day go off of YouTube. And in fact, that little movie thing you just showed here kind of took a little bit this away, because I'm going to show you this next thing is actually, they actually said a similar thing here. The other thing that's amazing about this is, again, they go from nothing in 2005 to they are now adding 24 hours of video are uploaded every minute. And ultimately, this is my number on this one. I don't know that I'll just, maybe this other movie had a little different there. But basically, more videos uploaded in 60 days in YouTube than all television networks produced in 60 years combined. And that's not just the US, that's all over the world. Crazy about a video that's going on, as you know. This is the one, though, that I think you should be keeping an eye on. Skype. There's now 500 million people now are opening channels across Skype. Video channels. Boom. All right, so the next thing, last little bit here in the tech space, so we start talking about the implications. It's the social space, as you're talking about here. And of course, you go down another generation. We went from boomers to Generation X. Now we're at the Millennials, which is the first big young mogul. Of course, Zuckerberg here with Facebook. But again, simple basics. What is that thing about social networks that's so powerful? It's the same network effect I just touched on before. Exponential doubling. And it's a simple thing, but let's review it. One guy asked 2 friends. Those 2 asked 2 friends. Everyone's just doing the same simple thing. It's just 2 people. All I'm asking is 2 people. Those 4 asked 2 friends. What's happening to the group, though, is you are doubling and doubling and doubling. And you do that one, it goes whoomp through the wall, boom across the street, boom. You get that same phenomena going on in this simple aggregation of building social networks. And which is why they get so powerful and so crazy so fast. So you've now basically got, in the space of literally just a handful of years, you've got Facebook, take the biggest countries in the world, China and India being right there. Facebook is now basically the 3rd biggest country in the world, right? And there isn't a peasant on it. I mean, it's essentially, they're all high school and college educated people. It's like the cream of the crop of the global population is now sitting in a nation, essentially, in an organized way that you could actually do. It's a crazy thing. But that happened overnight. Power networks, network effect, essentially. They were adding 700,000 people a day. Now, I don't know if that's actually consistent still right now, but this is about 9 months ago when I took this thing. 700,000 a day. That's like the size of the Los Angeles Times newspaper, which is essentially struggling to stay afloat, but in a day. And then the next day, there's another 700,000. It's crazy network effect, but it's really worth understanding those numbers. And of course, those numbers start to add up, where you start seeing these crazy numbers that we threw up in that thing. I mean, one thing that's worth pointing out here is when people say, well, gosh, you know, how many of those people really do stuff? Half of those people are on every single day, and the average time is an hour on there, which is a lot of time in a kind of a world that we're saying, oh my God, everything's 30-second things. People are spending an hour in this space, and half of it, well, actually, you said every other day, so that's, you're the average. There you go, every other day you're there. Anyhow, crazy numbers. And just to bring it around to the good old Twitter, everyone wants to mention that, but just to show you those numbers, same hockey stick, same, you can go across any of these things, they're all the same. And we said, they're adding 300,000 new users a day. Twitter now, 300,000 a day, it's just nuts how you get that going. Anyhow, crazy. So, technology, you know it, hopefully kind of added a little different connection, put it in a different context, but now I'm going to shift to the implications of all this technology. This is a space that I think technologists don't spend enough time understanding, and I think it's worth for you to really understand some of the really core things that are driving now through the world. We're going to shift a little bit here to different trends. The Millennial Generation, actually, let's just do this. The Millennial Generation, define it, is essentially anybody in their 20s or teens right now. And everybody kind of defines this a little differently. It does work across countries. It also works in Europe. It works in different parts of the world. I'll mention that in a minute here. But essentially, it's roughly a cohort of young people that's roughly 31, 32-ish now, the front left. It debates on when it starts. And it's essentially 13 or so now, age 13. Again, it debates a little bit. But think of it as teens and people in their 20s. Now, in the United States, and actually this is globally too, but I'll just use the numbers here. This is essentially an age pyramid. Demographically, people use it. Demographic people use it all the time. The young people at the bottom there, that's the age. The youngest age is the oldest age is at the top. They called it a pyramid in the old days because you had a lot more babies, and ultimately you'd have one old guy or old woman at the top, the wise old woman, and everybody died off in good order, except this is how until the baby boomers essentially came along, because they're not going away. So, and including, I'm a baby boomer, so I can actually say that. But anyhow, it's not really a pyramid anymore. Now, this is the American population projected in 2015. And there's a lot of debate on how we're going to deal with an aging population and all that. And this is happening in Europe. It's happening in China. It's happening all over. How do we deal with this phenomena of better health, better medical? Everything's kind of distorting this what used to be this pyramid. So anyhow, that's an issue I don't want to talk about. What I do want to focus on is this crew right there. The Millennial Generation is bigger than the baby boom. This is clear in Europe. It's all over the place. This next generation is bigger. And they are as influential, and it will probably be more transformational, I would argue, than make a bigger impact on the world than essentially the baby boom generation did. It's a very interesting generation. And in 2015, they'll all be adults. They will be the bulk of the economy. They will be the bulk of your consumers. They will be the folks that you have to understand. And whether you're employing them or whether you're selling to them, any business has to wrap their head on these folks. Now, you think, well, okay, I was a young person. I know what that's like. No. Every generation, very different personality. This is just an example of if you took the cultural vibe of the Generation X, which is the smaller generation between the boomers and the millennials. This is a cover story in Time in the 80s. You can even see Gorbachev there for those who are close enough there at the very top. Anyhow, that's a Generation X. It was a very kind of individualistic generation. They were very detached from kind of society. They didn't get involved in politics and things like that. They wore a lot of black. For those of you that, I'm sure there's a lot of Gen X's here. But if you take it now that this is a few years ago, Newsweek, the millennials, very different personality. They're boys, girls, they're always hanging on each other, they're very colorful. They can't do anything without a total swarm, you know. Anyone who has kids at this age, it's just crazy to watch them. They go in packs of 10, 20 people. Very different personality than just the generation right before them. So the thing is, you got to wrap your head around who are these people like. Now, we can do a whole talk on this, and I'm not going to do that, but I think it's worth pointing out some really interesting things. It is the most diverse generation in American history ever. 40% of them are from other different races. They do not see racial differences. They absolutely don't. They don't see that distinction. They're an extremely tolerant generation. They're the most endowed for all our hand-wringing of, oh my gosh, educational standards and everything else. They actually have been given more, grown up in more affluence than the boomers. I mean, think about it. I was like 18 before I was a boomer. I was a late boomer. I'm like an Obama-era boomer. I was like 18 before I got on a plane, and my little daughter has been on, 50 planes, and, she's, whatever, 8 years old you can get to, you know what I mean? It's crazy the kind of expansion a lot of these kids do. Not all, but most. Global. Most college kids now, or not most, but 30% of all college kids spend some time abroad. And in fact, in the elite schools, it's getting to be like 60 to 70% spend time abroad. It's the most globally connected generation we've ever seen. They're extremely civic-minded. Their levels of volunteerism are through the roof. They're much more engaged in politics than other young people. Very different than what we've seen before. And they're very can-do and optimistic about the future. And that's partly because, boom, they're born to this world. Now, before you start thinking, okay, we're just talking about America here. Actually, no. Let's just shift one thing here. The other thing about this diversification you got to see in America, that I will shift globally here, too, to kind of give a sense of how this is happening all over. The other thing is immigration. This is something that's hitting the whole world in big ways here, too. This is essentially the Hispanic kind of growth of the Hispanics in the United States. If you take the big swing, which I'm trying to do in this talk, 2050, this goes from 1980 to 2050. That's the growth of the American population in general in blue, and that's the growth, boom, there of the Hispanic population. 30% of all Americans will be Hispanic, or Hispanic origin, in the turn of the century. It's a big percentage. Now you start going, wow, that's interesting. Well, how does that work? And there's a lot of anxiety around this, and and Europe has the same kind of anxieties around this kind of immigration. But if you would have taken this same chart and applied it to the 20th century, in other words, if you started in 1880 and you ended in 1950, and you thought of those immigrants as essentially Irish, Italian, and Jewish, which at the beginning of that century were demonized and were completely trying to be shut out of this country. I mean, there was all these race riots and everything else up and down the United States. But what happened by mid-century? John F. Kennedy is the president, or running for president. Frank Sinatra is the heartthrob of entertainment in Italian. And essentially, Jack Benny is the comedian of the time, which is Jewish. Totally integrated, totally became American. Very, very kind of interesting integration, which we don't think of twice now. We think, oh, that's just natural. Same idea to wrap your head around what's happening in this country. Also, I think foreigners don't really fully appreciate this, but if you look at all race differences here in the United States, this is in 1960. This is the percentage of essentially minorities, or essentially different races, raising till today. And since it's a percentage, the percentage of whites comes down. So this is the America right there that elected Barack Obama. People thought, wow, how are you going to elect a black guy? But in fact, look at it. It's a melding country. And if you take that out with census data, in fact, they're thinking this is going to be earlier. They hit in basically 2050. Some people think it's going to hit as early as 2040. That peak tip right there is California. That's California right today. So it's not that bizarre, but it is different than a lot of parts of the country. Anyhow, that's what's happening in this country. And even now, we're watching percentages, all those border states, all over a third of those populations are all Hispanic. Some of them, look at that, well over 30%. And ultimately, the whole country is getting a really serious percentage of their populations do this. So this is a thing that's happening today. This isn't 2050, this is today. Now, how does that work globally? I did want to just point out, this is Tahrir Square in Egypt. So you think, okay, well, what's going on with this millennial generation? This is a good way. If you want to understand the Middle East, I gave you a little insight into technology. The other one is demographics. This is essentially, if you take the United States, everybody under age 30, which is the bulk of them are millennials, But granted, there's some little kids below that, right? We don't really know what that generation is. It's not formed yet. That's still a big chunk of your population in the United States is young people. But if you look at Tunisia, wow, there's a lot of trouble there. That started the whole thing. Well, they had over 50% of them were essentially under 30. And then you start going, Lebanon, Kuwait, Morocco, Saudi Arabia. Oh, Libya's got problems, right? 61% under 30. Egypt, that was a big thing, right? They're in that same league. Okay, you got Jordan here. Syria's a big problem, right? Yeah, 66%. Iraq, hey, Yemen's got a lot of problems, right? Boom. Almost 75% of people are under 30 there. Demographics, technology, combine them, boom. Young people do not give a rip about tradition. They don't think about the past. When you put young people in a lot of young people in a situation, and you give them powerful tools, they are going to be thinking about the future. They're not going to be thinking about the past. And that's why you're watching this explosive thing happening all over the world. Now, let's shift to economics here, because you're all business ultimately here, right? So we got to think about business. And this goes back to this article, actually. And ultimately, it was a book on this long boom. I do want to just bring it up to you guys because I think there is a very vital thing to understand about the technology is a driver of essentially long-term economic growth. Now, so when people, the long boom essentially is talking about not a stock booms or, it was essentially talking about the fundamental drivers of long-term robust economic growth. And what happens essentially is technology and the integration of actors in a market, increasing integration, those two factors, when you look at those things, when those things shift, they often, if not always, drive sustained economic growth in the big picture, the long run. Now let's just take an example of how it works. And you can see this in the post-war era, the great post-war era, which we all thought about as the great kind of economic boom of not just the United States, the West, all over the world. In essence, what happened there, I would argue, and argued in these other contexts as he mentioned, is essentially you had two things happen, big trends, that are very reminiscent of what we're seeing today, so it's worth going over. You had World War II ended, and those two big drivers surfaced. One is you had a range of technologies that period that had been developed in the war or before the war that all of a sudden went rushing into the private sector. Mainframe computers, atomic energy, commercial aviation, plastics. I mean, you name it. There was a ton of technology at that time that went whoop into the private sector. That, and you had half the world, the free world, organize themselves in a much more tightly integrated way. And so what happened? Boom. In the 50s, you had an American boom, particularly. And why America? It had survived the war, for one, and it pretty much intact. But also, Americans love to jump on new technologies, and they had the most open economy to take advantage of that kind of integration. So you had this crazy, nostalgic, we still talk about the great 50s, all the boats rising and building suburbia. But by the 60s, all Europe was on its feet, Japan was back on its feet, was totally booming. And it was only in the 70s when you essentially got the lifeblood of that industrial economy, oil, that kind of, with the oil shocks, and you kind of screwed up the whole thing, and that you essentially ended what had been about a 25 to 30-year run of really long-term fundamental long-road growth. Now, take our era. I would make a strong argument, and in general, you can think of this same phenomena basically happen. And what happened in the 80s? The Cold War essentially ends, and there was a wind down before it formally kind of ended, but it was clearly that this is ending. And so what happened at the end of the Cold War? All the technologies developed basically for military reasons. Computer chips. The beginning of the integrated circuits were for guided missiles. That's what drove them. The internet itself, communication in kind of nuclear war, we all talked about the origins of that. But spy satellites turn into GPS systems. I mean, all this kinds of technology just goes washing into the private sector, right? That's one thing. And then the second thing is the fact you take not just half the world, but you take the entire world and you get them all integrated on the same global economy. Wow, that's a big deal. We talked about the 80s. You got those two trends come together. What happens in the 90s? America's booming. Why America? They love this technology. They jump on it quick. And they're a very open economy, and so they can take advantage of it, right? So they're just going crazy. The great 90s boom, of course, we're all just like giddy about it here in the United States. But what happens this last decade, the 2000s, after the 2000, the entire world is booming. And when I say the entire world this time, it's not just Europe we're talking about. In fact, the real boom is China, India, the developing world, just like it was Japan and the kind of recovering Europeans of the 60s. That's the boom. That's the long boom. It might not have been as robust in the United States this last decade. In fact, there's hand-wringing about job creation, all this other stuff. But globally, the same phenomenon is going on. And the question is, what's going to happen this decade? Now, some would say we had a similar kind of flip out, which was very similar to the 70s thing, given the big crash. But ultimately, I think there's a lot to be played out here of what's really going to happen. I would say plenty more robust growth ahead in the global economy. So another thing to think about, too, because business people always get worried about recessions. And for good reasons, in terms of if you're looking at the kind of quarterly reports or that, the near-term kind of thing. But in the long run, essentially, this is GDP growth in the United States from the Great Depression basically to currently. And these red things are essentially recessions, and the length of recessions is how wide they are. So, of course, you had the Great Depression in the early times that really screwed things up to the 30s there from 29 on. But essentially, this is the 50s. The great 50s we talked about as the great boats, all boats rising. It was hammered with recessions. They were constantly working on recessions. This is, in fact, the 70s. We're getting hammered with recessions. Our era here, even if you include this last one, which we were technically out of now for a while, is relatively light on recessions. And the ultimate thing is what I'm saying is what really powers through is the long-term trend here. Where is that long-term trend going? Granted, it was a big dip here, similar back down there in trauma, essentially, to what we happened in the 29 crash. But roughly, there's a lot of upward motion. Globally, it's totally still tracking. Essentially, this is the post-war boom of essentially GDP, that top line there. We've now got a $65 trillion economy. It's slowed down a little bit since the late 20th century, but it's still tracking very nicely. And then you get China. And there's a lot of concern about China. What's going on with China? Let's just put China in context here, too. China didn't have an economy up until Deng Xiaoping opened the economy up in more of a free market way in basically 78. But look at that. That's the GDP growth. They didn't have GDP, essentially, until, boom, it started kicking in after that. Now, they are, as we well know, on a roll here in a kind of a very different way now. We're looking at growth into the century here. So let's just take, these are numbers from Goldman Sachs, not Pete Leiden here. This is up to 2050. Now, this is essentially projected American GDP growth. America, the biggest economy in the world, essentially going to track in pretty nicely through the next 50 years, probably here. That's China. Boom, surpassing the United States. People are actually arguing that's probably going to happen earlier. It has a lot to do with how the two countries perform, but roughly no one's disputing that that's surpassing the United States. That's India on a slightly stutter step behind, but it's ultimately catching the same upward trends by mid-century. That's Germany, that's Japan, that last one, essentially flatlining, and that's Germany. Now, Germany is part of the European Union, so it's a little different metric, but just look at those countries. Germany and Japan. So essentially, if you take the 2050 look here, that's the snapshot of the global economy in 2050. So the two powerhouses of the 20th century, beyond the United States, Germany, Japan, basically irrelevant in terms of the real drivers of the global economy. Now, Europe itself is a bigger animal, and Germany is part of that, so I don't want to get into that. But I'm just saying, what a reframing of how you got to think about economics. Now, the other thing I do want to say, though, is I was a foreign correspondent for Newsweek in Asia in the late 80s before I went to Wired. And there was a similar talk, all this hand-wringing about Japan at the time. I think it's worth just reminding ourselves here. In the 90s there, Japan was on an incredible roll in terms of their industrial economy. And we're doing terrific, and everybody was thinking, oh, my God. And the United States, meanwhile, was really floundering in the 80s, too, in many respects, the economy. Everyone was wringing their hands of where it was going. And so I remember doing all these stories about we're all going to be working for Japanese companies, and the world economy is essentially going to be Japanese very soon here. And, of course, what happened in the 90s, no one could predict it, but you watch Japan go into this stagnation, which, there's many reasons for it we could describe, including demographic. But ultimately, the United States kind of had this bounce, this reinvention through particularly internet technologies and others. So it's like, never really, follow the trend lines too tightly there. I would say the same thing is a little bit going on here about just talking about China and the United States this last decade. And I would argue, just keeping fluid here about what's going forward here, is I think it's not clear where these two economies are going to go. And I think it's very often we've watched these reinventions happen, about what goes on in the United States and also what I think could go on in China. Two examples here with China. China's done a remarkable job of bringing the poverty rate down. They had, in 1980, when they started this project, they had 80% of the people were living on $1.25 a day. And you go, wow, look at they've brought that down to 2009, it's 18%. But that's still 234 million people are essentially living on basically nothing, or very, very little. There's nobody in the United States or European countries in that kind of space. Anyhow, huge kind of challenges in terms of the fabric of their basic society. And another one I'll just mention in terms of anyone who's been doing traveling in China, as I have over the years, I mean, the environmental damage is just insane. I mean, for example, here what they've got here, there's only 1% of China's 560 million city residents who breathe air that's considered safe by the European Union, or basically by the United States standards too. I mean, they know this. I mean, they are, if you talk to the Chinese, they're trying to figure out very huge challenges, just like there's huge challenges all over the world. Now, this brings up the energy piece. And so, which is the last little section, well, actually, it's the little section here that we're going to kind of wind it up. This is something that I just think everyone has to figure out, but I think it has a big implication for business. And I think everyone, and then technologists should start wrapping their heads around this. Now, the basic way to understand it is there is this pressure of climate change. There's a big, robust debate still in the United States here about it. The Europeans and others have less of a debate going on it. But the basic facts are there is this crazy liftoff. This is CO2 in the atmosphere for the last 1,000 years, and essentially from the Industrial Revolution, which starts in the yellows, and modern days is the red there. CO2 is clearly going off the charts into the atmosphere. There's other facts. The late 20th century, this is 25 years of temperature rises all over the world. Reds being it's up, blues being it's down. Obviously, it's trending warmer. But so there's a whole debate around that we can talk about, and we don't want to go there in the short time we have here. The second thing, though, is this oil thing. Even for the oil industry and others have been thinking, well, gosh, there's limits on what we can do. There's only so much oil out there. And everyone has different projections on how much oil is out there. Is it 10, 20, 30 years? Are we hitting peak oil now? I mean, this is a serious, robust debate, even to those circles. But whatever you think is this is the price of oil from 86 to about now. It's been going up. And there's a lot of different scenarios on this. It could go up gradually, but even gradually, that's put a lot of pressure on resources. It could go up dramatically. And people do talk about $200 a barrel of oil relatively quickly here. This, whether it's an economic driver or ultimately a climate driver, whatever is happening here, we are in this shift, folks. And so the shift is happening, and we got to start wrapping our heads around it. And I would say here's the one way I think about it in terms of energy. The world consumes about 18 terawatts, which is just like your kind of guys have the same kind of tera, meta, in technology. It's roughly the same thing in energy. We absorb about 18, or we use 18 terawatts of energy a year. And it's coming from, if you look at those things, gas, coal, oil, plants is the green one. There's a ton of stuff we still burn, particularly in the developing world. But mostly that's how we consume our energy. That's where we're getting our energy globally. The little sliver there of the red is nuclear, which is clean in terms of its CO2 output, and the very small little slivers of how much we currently do with solar and wind. So it's essentially not much. This is essentially how we consume energy, and it's not just about cars. People think, oh, it's transportation. Electricity, agriculture, heating, cooking, all kinds of stuff. The entire economy is based on energy, right? This, if you talk about growth of energy use, this is from the 70s, 1970 to current. The entire world consumption is going up, and every one of those slivers is a country. The United States is at the baseline there. The red is China, and that orange is India. So it's clear the world's sucking up more and more energy, and it's only going to go up as the developing world goes. So it's like, we're doing more energy. This is the United States energy consumption for the century from 1900 to now. The one way to look at this is blues are carbon-based. If you look at coal at the bottom there, coal was our biggest, was the majority of energy in the turn of the century, the 1900, essentially flatlined. But look at oil is the big one, the big purple one there. So we're growing in energy use, more and more carbon use. So ultimately, a lot of people are starting to wrap their heads on, we have to figure out a way, we're never going to get totally off of carbon, but a lot of people are starting to think, we can bring down our energy use through, kind of efficiency. That's why we can maybe bring it from 18 to 16. And there's still going to always be some carbon use. We have to do it. And even everybody, even the most hardcore folks on climate change think, yeah, absolutely, there's always going to be in the mix. So the question is, we have to come up with close to 11 to 12 trillion, 11 to 12 terawatts of clean energy in the next 20 to 30 to 40 years, depending who you listen to, whether it's driven by climate or whether it's driven by the end of oil. So this is what we have to have shifting. There has to be some mix where nuclear certainly has to expand. That's controversial to some people, but it's basically from a climate change point of view is a clear way to go, and essentially that's where a lot of people are going. But also these other mixes, you're going to have to figure out wind, geothermal, solar, and there will be, like I say, a substantial amount still of carbon. But essentially, it's a huge build-out. Now, the question is, we have the technology. We know the engineering. This is basically a matter of how we really push through. Now, we're not waiting for some super breakthrough. When I say we have the technology, it's not like everything's figured out yet, but essentially, we're in the space to do it. Now, this is, again, just take the electrical grid in the United States. This is the current way, the mix of what it feeds into the electrical grid here. Coal, natural gas, petroleum, nuclear. Somehow, now 2020 is pretty ambitious there, but somehow you got to get to some other kind of mix there, and this is different people trying to figure out what is that mix. Anyhow, the reason I'm saying this is going to have big implications on business. You're already seeing it in the sustainability movement. You're already seeing it in the pressure of everybody to kind of wrap their heads around this. This is a big deal. Which brings us back to this. The 21st century challenges I mentioned to you before. We talked about all these things happening in the world, this big transformation we're going through, this big shift. How are we actually going to do it this time? And I think just to wrap up this little talk, I want to bring up the final thing here, which I think affects your business, really, is I think we're going to see a paradigm shift in problem solving, how we actually solve problems. And it's basically, in your world, related to collaboration. How do we do more complex and nuanced collaboration from afar? If we can make this shift, a lot of these questions start to get more easy. Now, to remind ourselves, what are the key? There's 3 key attributes of technology that essentially can be applied to this problem that start to really make it a big deal. One is its ability to scale. You can do anything bigger, at bigger scale, quicker scale through technology. We've been through all the ways the network effect works and how that works. So let's just say, so if we apply technology that way, we can start to get many more people involved in this. Well, when you start to do that, the other thing that technology allows you to do is to parallel process. And this is a great, server farm. You remember the days when everybody was thinking, you got to get bigger and bigger brains. Supercomputer brains is what really is going to make faster and faster computing. And someone said, wait a minute. What if you essentially broke a problem down, distributed it among smaller kind of little brains, more cost-efficient computers for that matter, and then reassembled the answers, and boom, maybe that would actually be a scalable way to actually get a more powerful kind of brain work, and then essentially a very expensive supercomputer. And essentially that's what every Google search query does now. Does it in lightning fast time with fiber optics and in ways that you connect up these things. It happens in the blink of an eye. But in fact, it's like, distribute the problem. Well, there's essentially an analog what you could do with that scale of people solving problems. Because all those issues I had mentioned to you before, every one of those you got to delve into, and you got to figure out sub-issues around there to solve. Just in clean energy its own, there's all these other issues you got to wrap your head around of how to solve. But the thing is, with technology, you can finally get that kind of large-scale parallel processing, getting many, many people working on the same scale of problems. And the third piece, we all know, is it collapses space. It shrinks the globe, as we well know. I mean, just, people in this room can remember when long-distance telephone calls were, like, expensive, and you couldn't call Europe except on a special occasion kind of thing. But anyhow, what's worth kind of thinking through is that we have watched an evolution from a physical meeting to a virtual meeting. And let's just think this through. There was a time where, yeah, you could get on that phone call, but it was kind of that expensive long-distance phone call. Then we got email, and we said, we can mail documents in real time. People can just pull it up on their screens. I mean, a lot of our meetings are still held this way. And then you start going, we got instant messaging. You can, in fact, we got IP phones. It doesn't cost anything to do these things. And then there was essentially, we can open video channels between these meetings. We can work on the same doc, Google Doc. And we can use these various wikis, here. And anyhow, there's been this proliferation of single-purpose collaboration tools going out. What's happened now is you're watching essentially, the next generation was essentially, let's kind of connect all these pieces in integrated kind of suites of tools, and particularly the big folks, IBM's Connections, Microsoft SharePoint, a lot of these were saying, okay, let's figure out a way to make this more robust in an enterprise situation. Now you've got a whole generation of these web startups. I don't know if you've used Jive or some of these other ones, but essentially they're trying to integrate this whole experience and make it kind of more accessible to anybody, not just enterprise situations. And ultimately, I would say in the next 5 years, I would look for a ton of new innovation in this space till ultimately we're going to get close to that holy grail of collaboration from afar with the same complexity that you get in a meeting. Now, it'll never totally go away. There's something that, you're networking and connection face-to-face and having drinks together and, going out late at night and giving a big hug, group hug or something. That's, you're never going to basically quite get all that there. But this is getting really within grasp. And I would just say, what I want to just show you here is one example of this, which I think is an insight into the future a little bit. And this is, I don't know, maybe some of you seen this, but this was a guy who basically is a composer who basically said, hey, I'm going to take advantage of this kind of technology structure, this video structure, and I'm going to put out an audition, get people to audition for parts in my choir through the internet. You're going to basically, and they put out, here's, what you want. I want you to sing and try out. And these young people, particularly, there's mostly young people, as you'll see here, did their little pitch. They sang, and he selected the right ones, and then he got them all orchestrated. You sing this, you sing this, you sing this, and totally asynchronously. They gave him a week or two to do it. He watched all the feeds come in, and through an edit, essentially, they put together the choir. Now, the reason I'm putting this out to you is think for a minute the incredible, nuanced, complex collaboration it takes to make this music, and think about all the different ways you could actually use this for other things to do with your business even. A little look. If you can do that for just a beautiful choir, what could you do using those same kind of braids, those same kind of bides, that same basic functionality? All they had were the little webcams built into every PC now. Had a whole generation. Notice how all those folks were the millennials, maybe occasional older folk. Incredible potential of what these folks and this generation and these tools could do. And with that, I'm going to basically wind it out in a last little bit here, is to go back to where I started. There were these inventions. There were these explosions of kind of innovation that we've talked about in the past. If you look at what's happening today, we're in a kind of a similar situation. Now, the last time I mentioned those four, the last time this happened, let's just think what was going on then and think about how it might give us confidence of what's going to happen now. The last time you saw it, you had a similar situation where you said the world was up against these really intractable problems. They had a financial collapse at that time was unparalleled. They had the Great Depression, couldn't get out of it. They had the rise of fascism, which they thought was going to take over the world. And they also had the beginnings of nuclear war. Nuclear war was essentially their climate change issue, which at the time, if you remember, was just as daunting and just as kind of perplexing to them. So what they did, though, this is kind of FDR's kind of kitchen cabinet, including the guy, Vannevar Bush, in the middle there, who essentially is thought of as the father of the vision of the web. He's the first guy to really understand, think about a machine that could connect all the world's information. But anyhow, they took the technologies they had at the time and the human resources they had, and ultimately, in the space of literally about 15 years to 20 years, they essentially figured out a way to get out of the Great Depression with a different kind of economics at that time. They essentially figured out a way to defeat fascism and contain communism and the way to kind of get this nuclear balance, which frankly worked. We haven't nuked ourselves out since. They built the entire from scratch, a whole international system, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, all that was built within 3 years, just whole cloth, just like boom. And ultimately, you watched a bunch of different kind of programs that essentially got that GI generation all moving. A lot of innovation, Social Security, a bunch of things in our country, but also this happened in the post-war European world as well. Crazy amount of innovation happened within the space of just a relative historical blink of the eye. And so we look back on that and we say, oh man, they solved their problems. And then somehow we look at our era and we think, how are we ever going to do that? Well, essentially, we're at a very similar juncture in history. And so what are we going to do? We're essentially facing a similar slight of like, oh my God, those same images I mentioned to you there. But ultimately, we've got even more human resources. In fact, you're a human resource thing. This is a firm that's taking advantage of this. We're looking at a situation. This is essentially college-educated people in the United States, starting in the war, essentially 1940. It says 1950 there because it's just moving up there, but it starts in 1940 and it essentially goes to today. And so now we've got 30%. We had actually less than 5% of the entire country in the United States was college-educated. Now we got about 30. In real terms, essentially, it's the difference between 5.6 million people educated with education, advanced, college education then compared to today. 15 times as many. Now, that's not to say only people with college educations essentially have something value to do, but it's essentially not a bad metric to understand the knowledge base of what your economy is like or your society is like. But the key thing, and the thing for your conference and the thing for this talk is, what if you would have told guys like FDR or Churchill or all these folks, and you would have said, you know what? We're going to put this thing on your desk, or better yet, we're going to give you this thing in your hand. You can ask any question in the world, and you will get all the world's information ordered back to you in a second. Everybody would have looked at you and said, that is total magic. It's like impossible. And of course, it's called Google or whatever you want to call it, Bing, and every 5-year-old in the developed world knows how to do it right now. It's an extraordinary tool. The powers are just unbelievable in a historical context. And so we are totally able to make this transition in this kind of critical moment of the history. We are totally able to make this full move to the kind of totally computerized, totally interconnected society, one that's basically built in a global framework, which we've never been able to wrap our heads around, one that's moving in the direction of essentially a different energy infrastructure, and it's ultimately solving a lot of these questions, including these big, difficult climate ones. It is a century trajectory we're on for the next 10, 20, 50 years, but we are on it. And it starts with folks like yourself who know technology. And it starts with all of us outside of this room as well. And it is the story we're going to be living for the next couple decades of our lives. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for your attention. And we can actually go to the next cycle of the day. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions real quick for Peter? Up here where I can see a little bit. Anybody?
A lot of information there.
Yeah, please.
So what do you think of all the video stuff, the Cisco stuff? And I mean, I would say we're not really, our offices aren't connected the way that they could be from a video perspective. I mean, we're moving to IP phones. What do you think? What do you think our trend could be in the next 2 to 3 years with video?
In between your home offices and stuff?
Right.
I mean, I'm very bullish, as you see in this context, but I'll elaborate on that. I am very, very bullish on video. I just think it is worth getting ahead of that curve. I think the costs are going so down to nothing. I think these channels are opening. I think it's going to be expected of businesses. I think it totally improves the communication of meetings. I often do I'm in San Francisco. I do a lot of my European business now. I do through Skype. I mean, the Europeans seem to be more hooked into it. But we essentially, it's just such a richer experience. And I think as Skype itself is adding all these side things, you can trade, information, documents in real time, and you could do all that kind of stuff too. So I think it is a trend that is not only going to move bigger and bigger. Now, does that mean you have to invest a ton of money into it immediately? I would, it's your own kind of internal trajectory you have to think about. But I would say it will increasingly be the norm. And I think the insight, as I mentioned, I'll be more explicit about it. If you look at where the big technology companies are placing their bets, and that Skype buy by Microsoft was a really insightful one. And actually, you've watched how Google has essentially built this Google Talk, which is essentially their video channel, which is a free way now to connect basically through the United States and Canada, but globally even too. They're all the big players. Microsoft, Google, and Apple are essentially positioning themselves for this world. And as we know, all these different devices now, including the iPad, has got cameras. Why do they have cameras on both sides? Because they're betting that essentially those tablets are going to be essentially the way you'll just constantly be interacting with people. And I think it's just, it's beyond speculation that something interesting and amazing will come in there. And whether it'll be absolutely essential to everything you do, it's hard to say. You never know with total certainty, but I would say it's past the threshold now of wondering whether people will, there was all this thing, like I've watched this from Wired days, speculation of the video phone. Well, we've had a capability for video phones from, the 60s, and oh my God, we technically could have done it in the 90s. And yeah, there is that kind of argument, but we've never had the kind of infrastructure like this, the kind of video infrastructure, and the fluency in how to use video, make video, and communicate with video that we have now. And I think that's where, other than writing on the walls, look at the next generation. Anyone who has a college kid in here, of which I do, it's the way college kids connect with their parents. It's like the Sunday video chats. And I mean, it's just starting to watch how that's just baked into the way generations now, even grandparents are connecting with the grandchildren. And just watch that thing go. It's just out of the box, it's happening, it's getting into the way we work, and I think it'll be the way business is done. And so start doing it. There's a couple other questions.
Yeah.
Okay,
Two
go
more
ahead.
minutes, yep.
Equal deterioration in the written word?
You
see this boom in video. What about the written word?
The question was, do I see a deterioration of the written word? Well, I would say, I think the primacy of the written word, I think in this last iteration, let's just think of it as an iteration of the internet, which is the last 15 to maybe say, let's say the last 15 years of the internet, which is the beginning of the internet to now, roughly, in terms of popular consumption. Those who could write, now it's like you tweet, effectively, can you do a little witty kind of tweet? Can you basically write a cool blog post that people get? I mean, writing has been the primary way to really grab people. I think that primacy is definitely over. I think it's now going to be those who can communicate visually is going to come into its own. Now, does that mean the written stuff and the written tools will go away? Absolutely not. It'll still be there. But it's kind of the similar way to think of it is think of what happened with the advent of television in the 60s, right? The world was organized around newspapers, essentially, and magazines, you could say. And then television came in. It was a goofy thing for a while in the 50s, and you kind of would watch it, and you're like, why am I watching this? And then it started to get serious in the 60s. It started to impact politics. It started to cover race riots. And, oh, my God, this thing is interesting. And once it snapped into the new formula of how video worked through television at that time, it became the dominant way that we basically communicated Now, did newspapers go away? No. Were they important still? Yes. Was it better for, books still, long form, written things were important? Yes. But where did the zeitgeist of the culture go? Where were the kind of the celebrities of the culture? Where did it go through? It went through this visual medium. And why? It's because we've been working at this for a million years. We know how to communicate face to face. No one has to learn how to write well. You just talk. And you know how to get your, lover to kind of smile, and you know how to get your mom to kind of mellow out, and just gestures, and we know how to communicate like that, and to do that with nuance in writing, it takes a real skill, and a lot of people don't have that skill. Everyone has the ability to communicate like this, and that's why it's a big deal. That's why the fundamental thing about video is it is going to democratize communication as much as it's going to allow much more complex communication in a much more compacted way. A 2-minute conversation with someone video is going to be a much richer, more complex experience than any 2 minutes you're going to get writing up 2 minutes. You can barely write anything in 2 minutes, right? Anyhow, it's a very big deal. Okay, here's a question.
In terms of collaboration, social networking, how do you see that impacting professional decision training? Do you see them outside of their own organization working together to solve problems, or to advance things?
Yeah, did everyone hear that question? Or it's how does do you see how does the collaboration really work with professionals inside and outside your organization? Is that what you say? I think professionals are going to blaze a trail on this. I mean, there's always the kind of, look to the young generation of how they're monkeying with it in funny ways. But I think this is really where the rubber hits the road right now. It is a huge cost for businesses to move bodies around the planet and put them up in hotels and have these face-to-face meetings, and how much time is wasted. I mean, I spend, what chunk of my life has been wasted in airports? I don't know, but it's like a lot. And I think anything that's allowing you to do very complex communication from afar is going to be an efficient business practice. And so I think there's going to be a lot of energy put into it, and I think there's going to be, in fact, you're already watching, the real breakthroughs are happening. As I mentioned there, the most sophisticated collaboration platforms are essentially these business solutions coming from IBM and Microsoft and WebEx, which is bought by Cisco, and Google tried this Google Wave. For those your technologists, you just watch it. I thought Google Wave was essentially, I would love Google Wave. My company got very involved in it, partnered with them quite deeply around that. And then they pulled the plug on its development because it didn't have the uptake that they thought were waiting for it. I think Google Wave was essentially 2 years ahead of its time, but it essentially was a tool that was trying to essentially allow much more complex interaction in real time and asynchronously between serious folks. And that will return in some form. So I think, yeah, business is going to drive this, and I think it's, as a business, just like you mentioned, you jumped into the filing the electronically the forms, and now you got whatever, you're dominating the business. I think this is a space that I would not hesitate to get more invested in and really try to push it, because I think it's going to just, it's going to constantly open up. Now, how far ahead of the curve you want to be, it has to do with your risk factor. Do you want to try a few things and crash, or do you have enough cash to try some experiments? Then do it. If not, it'll get sorted out in the next 2, 3, 4 years, and you fast follow that. That's another way to go. But I will say, tune into this development. It's here finally. I see other hands, but there is definitely. How about in the back there? Yeah. Huh. Did everyone hear that? He was just pointing out a development which I'm not actually aware of Facebook and American Idol setting a new site up. What was the name of the site? Oh, I see. So it's essentially a way that's building off of Facebook and other technologies to kind of, through wisdom of crowds, see an emergent candidate that you would support for the presidency. Well, I will say this much. What was not mentioned in my bio is that I actually left, I essentially dedicated myself from 2004 to 2008 to essentially, I drove a thing, I was a founding director of a thing called the New Politics Institute, which was trying to help people in politics wrap their head around the fundamental shift that happened in essentially the paradigm of doing politics around these new tools. And so I was deeply involved in all that, including, frankly, rolling into Obama's campaign in 2008. And so we essentially applied all these tools to essentially winning in politics. And it's clearly kind of shifted the paradigm of doing politics in this country and other places too. I would say that same level of innovation is now being applied for this cycle. I'm not as intimately involved in it as I was that last cycle, but I would say really watch what happens in politics this next couple years, at least in the American cycle here, because there are a lot of really interesting things that are emerging in the next generation of kind of not just politics winning, but essentially ways to collaborate socially and politically to kind of get things done in our society. It's kind of in the continuum of that collaboration tools I talked about. And I would say hold on to your hats, because I think it's just really starting. When we're just starting, who would have predicted what happened in the Middle East just earlier this year? All of a sudden, explodes. Stuff's ripe to happen. So I think with that, it's a good place to end to just say, folks, we are living in the beginning of a quite wondrous kind of period here, and you actually know something that a lot of people need to know, and so you should feel good about where you are. And but think about the larger implications of the things you do every day in your business. Essentially, also have a lot of larger implications, including at the society at large. So, good luck with your conference. Sounds like a terrific one. I'm happy to stay here if people want to talk later in the break here. But thank you very much for having me here.